Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Julia Rothkopf, and I'm the program associate at YIVO. Today we have Elyada and Sam Spinner joining us to discuss the afterlife of Yiddish in German Jewish culture, 1818 to 1938. And today's program is co-sponsored by the Leo Baeck Institute, and we're very grateful for their co-sponsorship. For those who do not know YIVO, we are a very special place for the celebration, exploration, and contemplation of Yiddish and Eastern European Jewish culture. We are located in New York City, where our library and archive contain over 24 million documents and 400,000 books, which are used by researchers from all over the world. We also have lots of classes on Yiddish language and culture, exhibitions, and public programs, just like this one, where we aim to bridge the worlds of Jewish culture and our vast collections. So thank you for joining us. I will first briefly introduce our speakers, and then we will get started with the program. Aya Elyada is Associate Professor in the Department of History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her research focuses on Yiddish-German encounters and the social history of language and translation. She is author of A Goy Who Speaks Yiddish, Christians and the Jewish Language in Early Modern Germany, and co-editor of German Jewish Studies, Next Generations. She is currently working on a DFG-funded project on Old Yiddish adaptations of German literary text, 1400 to 1800. And Samuel Spinner is Associate Professor in Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture at Johns Hopkins University. He specializes in Yiddish and German Jewish literature and culture from the 19th century to the present. He's author of Jewish Primitivism and is currently working on a book on Holocaust memory. He co-edits the German Jewish Culture series at Indiana University Press and serves on the editorial board of Inga Web. So thank you for joining, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you, Professor Aya Elyada, for writing this great book. I'm very excited to be able to talk with you about it, to explore some of the important findings that you've made in your research and ideas that you bring out here, and just take the opportunity to introduce this book and your research to a broad audience of people from all over the place. It's pretty exciting. So hello, and thank you for writing this book.
Hi, Simon. Thanks so much for having me and for having this interview. And I'm thrilled to be here. So thank you also to YIVO Institute, to the Leo Baeck Institute for this great opportunity to talk about what has been a long but a gratifying project.
So just a reminder to everybody, if you look on the chat, you can find a link to the Stanford University Press page for this book, A Lingering Legacy, and you can take 20% off with the code that's in the chat, Elyada20. So make sure you scroll up until you find that link and you find that coupon code and absolutely buy the book. It happens to have a very beautiful cover and lots of cool illustrations inside, but also the words are interesting and it's worth reading. So now that we've got that out of the way, we can dive in. But actually, before we dive into the book, let's linger, if you will, on the cover for a moment. And the title, A Lingering Legacy, The Afterlife of Yiddish in German Jewish Culture, 1818 to 1938. Yiddish, of course, remains a living language, and it was then too. So if you could tell us what you mean by afterlife, and then maybe expand a little bit and just tell us about the general topic of the book.
Okay, thanks very much. So maybe I should start by explaining what this book in fact does. And this book explores a practically unknown chapter in the history of the Yiddish-German encounter, specifically in the engagement of modern German Jews with Yiddish literature. Now we have, of course, excellent studies by Jeffrey Grossman, Delphine Bertel, many others, who researched and explored the engagement of modern German Jews with modern Yiddish that emerged in Eastern Europe in the second half of the 19th century, in the early 20th century. Of course, the most famous names, Sholem Aleichem, Yud Lamed Peretz, Medlem Chosforim, and others. What I was trying to do in this book is to bring to light the German Jewish engagement with what we may term the other Yiddish, namely Old Yiddish literature or early modern Yiddish literature that flourished in the German Jewish communities during the early modern period, but then ceased to be published in Germany around 1800. And hence the term afterlife, because the Yiddish that I am speaking about in my book is no longer alive between 1818 and 1938. And this corpus was once very popular, very influential in Ashkenazi culture. But then, as I said, after 1800, it dies, so to say, but then it has an afterlife. So perhaps before I explain a bit more about the book, maybe it's worthwhile to say a few words about what Old Yiddish literature in fact is, right? We thought maybe it would be a good idea just to give a little bit of background. So I will share screen, if that's okay, just to show a few images of Old Yiddish texts. So Old Yiddish literature, okay, or perhaps I should start by saying that, of course, Yiddish emerged in the German territories, in the medieval German territories, and was for centuries the language, the vernacular of the German Jews. And it was the everyday, the spoken language, but it was also a written language and had a very rich and diverse corpus of literature. And it had different genres and groups, and I will just mention some main groups of texts and some examples. So first and foremost, we have religious literature, for example, translations of the Bible into Yiddish, adaptations of biblical books into Yiddish. We have biblical lexicons. We have books of morality and proper conduct, like the Brandspiegel or Sefer Lev Tov, who instructed the Jews how to live a good Jewish life and how to keep all the mitzvahs. And of course, we have the jewel in the crown, the Tzene Rene, which lived long after that also in Eastern Europe. My grandma was still reading the Tzene Rene in the shtetl. So this book, it got the nickname Women's Bible, or the YIVO Chumash, in German Frauenbibel. This was in fact a paraphrase of the weekly portions of the Torah with the Haftarot, with Megillot, and it would translate sentences from the Bible into Yiddish and then elaborate with all kinds of midrashim and agadot and halachic statements and interpretations and so on. And this was, it was addressed to everyone, but with time it became known Women's Bible because it was especially the reading of women on Sabbath and on holidays. Then we have a different kind of genre or of group of texts, and these are the folk tales, Jewish folk tales, and you can find folk tales in all kinds of other Old Yiddish texts, but this is the most famous compilation of Old Yiddish folk tales, the Maisebuch, Book of Tales. The other folk tales were Maises. And here, most of the Maises in the Maisebuch, it has about 250 stories in it. Most of them are from Jewish origins. They came from the Midrashic and Talmudic literature, from the Jewish Agadah. It also has stories from medieval Ashkenaz, the Hasidei Ashkenaz circle, but it also has tales from European folklore that entered Yiddish via German. And this brings me to another corpus within Old Yiddish literature, a very interesting corpus. And this is the Yiddish adaptations of German literary texts, of German prose and fiction, because the Jews were not only interested in reading the Bible and study Judaism and so on. they also wanted to have fun, to have entertainment, and they found it in the German surroundings. And so we have, for example, this is an example of a medieval German chivalric romance from the Arthurian cycle, Vigalois, and we have Yiddish adaptations. We have in manuscripts and also in print, Ein Schein Meise von König Artis Hof. So it's really a chivalric romance about the adventures of knights from the circle of King Arthur. Another example, novellas from early modern German novellas that were translated or adapted into Yiddish. We have the Lallenbuch, also Schildbürgerbuch, which would later become the Chachmei Chelem. So this is the origins of Chachmei Chelem. We have Till Eulenspiegel, the adventures of this reckless person that also found their way into Yiddish. So we have really here, we have to say about Old Yiddish literature, that it was a very rich, diverse corpus that was meant to address the cultural, intellectual, religious, and pedagogical needs, and also entertainment needs of just, you know, early modern Jews, men and women, the broadest circles of the population. So this literature was very, very popular until it disappeared around 1800.
Just a couple of follow-up questions about just the historical background. If you could speak a little more both about the period. You start at 1400, and almost all the examples you showed were printed books with one manuscript. And then also the region. Where were these things written? Where were they published? Where were they read?
Okay, that's an excellent question, because first of all, we have manuscript. We already have like a first manuscript from the 14th century. But, you know, we can say by and large between 1400, 1800. And of course, with the printing press, we have an explosion of texts. It also depends what came down to us, right? And the printed texts have more chances to come down to us. So the main corpus, I would say, starts in the 16th century. Right, and the first Yiddish book was printed in 1534, and after that there is really an explosion, and many books are printed. Not everything has come down to us, but it starts earlier with manuscripts, of course. Now, regarding the geographical zone, this is very interesting because we need to remember that in the early modern period we have a huge Ashkenaz, sometimes divided in research between Ashkenaz 1 and Ashkenaz 2. Ashkenaz 1 is the German territories. And in the late Middle Ages, when the Jews leave the German territories due to pogroms and expulsions and so on, and they move to Eastern Europe, they bring Yiddish with them. So that during the early modern period, we have an entire era, the entire geographical zone of Ashkenaz that includes both the German territories and Eastern Europe, and they all use the same Yiddish literature, the same Old Yiddish literature. So the same books were disseminated and circulated from Amsterdam to Krakow. And there were also many printing presses in the German territories.
Were there any specific places that were sort of centers of publishing of these works, or it was just wherever Jewish books were printed, these books were printed?
Both, and wherever there were printing presses, they would print that. Krakow was a center at the time. Amsterdam became a center later on. We also have many books from northern Italy from the 16th century, where Ashkenazi Jews came. But as I said, all this stopped around 1800 due to the plain fact that the German Jews started to replace Yiddish with German. And here we have the breakup of Ashkenaz. So it was an entire cultural entity, both the German territories and Eastern Europe. And from the late 18th century, with the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, with the processes of emancipation, of modernization that started among German Jews, the German Jews gradually start to replace Yiddish in German. So they abandon the Yiddish of the forefathers and they adopt the German. And they also do it in literature. German becomes also the literary language of the German Jews. And from around 1830 at the latest, we can already speak about really a corpus of German Jewish literature in German.
Right.
And this is how we can say that all this literature died in Germany because the Jews stopped reading it and moved to reading German.
Could you say just a little bit more about that process, since it's such an important background to then what your argument and what your discoveries are about?
Sure. So it starts, we can say that this process of this language shift, right, from Yiddish to German, it starts both from above and below. From above, it means that with the edicts of emancipation and toleration that the Jews started to receive in the German territories from the late 18th century and throughout the 19th century, these edicts gave them more freedom and more civil rights and enabled them to integrate into society. But they always had this one condition: the Jews must switch to German. They cannot maintain their own language. So it came from above. They need to open German schools for the kids or send their kids to German schools. And so this came from above. But it also, this demand for this language shift also came from below. It came from inside the Jewish community. First of all, from middle-class Jews that saw the importance and the utility of having German as your language and not Yiddish as a ticket to success in life, but also the Haskalah, Moses Mendelssohn and other maskilim, who saw this replacement of Yiddish with German really a prerequisite for the regeneration of Jewish life. So it was not just something practical, right? We want to acculturate, we want to integrate. It was really seen as a key to regeneration of Judaism itself. Yiddish was seen as jargon, as a mixed language, mishprache. It was no good for serious culture, serious education. It's not a language for Bildung, so you had to get rid of it and move to German.
So there's this social process of German Jews in fits and starts, in some places faster, in some places slower,
Mhm.
switching from speaking their vernacular of the dialect of Western Yiddish to speaking German. But then what about literature? Is literature kind of hanging on longer? Are people reading these books while they're switching the way they're speaking? Or does it kind of track at the same rate of change?
So of course, privately, books are still there and people still read them. But as I said, they stopped to be published. The very last Old Yiddish work that is to be published in Germany is the Zenerene in the 1830s, but this is a very late remnant. They stopped to be published. They are being excluded from the public sphere. So even if some, elderly people, more orthodox ones in the villages and so on, perhaps they continue to read here and there privately, but it's not part of the public sphere, of the cultural sphere of German Jews anymore. And they, as I said, they gradually just turn to German.
And then as that happens, there's a rediscovery of the thing that has sort of just faded. So,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
that's the topic of your book. So, how did you sort of discover that? How did you get to this and realize this needs to be a book?
So, in my previous book, A Guy Who Speaks Yiddish, it was also about the early modern period. And then I learned about this corpus. I wasn't aware of that there was an old Yiddish literature and what it meant. And I was fascinated with the corpus. And then I thought, how can it be that it just disappeared from German Jewish culture? Like that they had this huge heritage and then they just, dump it and move on and that's it. That's end of story. And also when I started to learn more about modern German Jewish culture, I realized two things. First, they were very much interested in the Jewish past. Jewish past more broadly, but also their own German Jewish past, their Ashkenazi past, the Wissenschaft des Judentums, with all the historians there and literary historians. They were so fascinated with the past and engaged with that. This on the one hand, and on the other hand, from the late 19th century, we see that they are very much interested in modern Yiddish culture, and there are many translations from Yiddish into German and so on. So if they're interested in the past and they're interested in Yiddish, where is Old Yiddish literature? Have they forgotten about it? And then I started digging. And once you start digging, you're bound to find something. And not only that I found something, I found that there is a very, very large corpus of German Jewish writings on Old Yiddish literature. And in this corpus, the Old Yiddish literature are being translated, adapted, retold, discussed. So we have many different works. We have translations and adaptations. We have literary surveys, literary reviews, anthologies, bibliographical lists. So they were engaged with this literature. And I gave it the name Afterlife because there was no revival of Old Yiddish literature. They didn't say, oh, let's reprint it, right? Or let's give it to our readers as is. No, this entire discourse was about Old Yiddish literature or translations and adaptations of Old Yiddish literature, but everything was done in German, in Latin characters. And this is very important because, as I show in the book, and as we all know, the 19th century German Jews really excluded Yiddish. They really rejected Yiddish. They didn't want any comeback of Yiddish. They disliked the language and they wanted to speak German. But I show that the fact that they rejected the language doesn't mean that they rejected the literature. They were very much interested in the literature and fascinated by it, but it had to be translated. It had to be mediated, and hence the afterlife.
Right. So, I mean, the sort of one of the, I guess, most visible examples that's sort of almost an archetype for that 19th century German Jewish rejection of or blindness to the German Jewish history is the sort of revival of the neo-Moorish architecture, the interest in the literature and culture, the visual culture as well of Iberian Jews in the Middle Ages before the expulsion. And so you start getting synagogues designed in this kind of knockoff of that medieval Iberian Moorish style. And I guess it could seem, and there's been a certain kind of mythologization almost that was the main interest in the past, and you could see it in the massive synagogues, right? But of course, the scale of a building is different than the scale of a book which you read, and you've obviously shown that the continued presence of a literature, even in translation, makes a lot of claims about the importance of a specific history and of what that continuity means. And so I guess the question about what does that continuity mean, what was the purpose of this afterlife, is the key question. And maybe you could start speaking about that. Your term for the sort of blanket term for the process is diachronic translation, well, I'll let you explain what it is.
No, of course. So first of all, you're absolutely right. They were fascinated with the Sephardic heritage, that's for sure, and they saw it also as a model. Their engagement with the Ashkenazi past and the Yiddish heritage had a somewhat different course and a somewhat different purpose. And we can speak about that later. But indeed, what they do with this, I took this term, diachronic translation, as opposed, for example, the translation from Eastern Europe to German Jewish culture, which was geographical and synchronic. And the idea is that we usually think about translation as being from a contemporaneous culture and a different culture, right? It's like intercultural. And here we have a somewhat different process. First of all, it's on the temporal axis, right? It's a translation from the early modern to the modern. And also it's a kind of a self-translation because in the eyes of these translators, the German Jews, they translated books that were part of their own heritage. It was part of their own past culture. It was what their grandparents and great-grandparents read and used as a living culture. This diachronic translation means that it's between the early modern and the modern, and it also has implications like what does it mean to take a book from the early modern period and put it in the modern period. So, for example, we see that they don't always feel comfortable with everything in the content of these books, or they don't like the aesthetics of these books. When Avraham Tendlau, for example, translates or writes adaptations of stories from the Meisebuch in the mid 19th century, he says, oh, we have to rescue these wonderful tales from oblivion, and this is why I'm translating them here. But I made sure to translate them in a modern form. So it's important for him. He doesn't like the aesthetics of Old Yiddish. He wants it to be in a, what does it mean, modern form? It means German form, right? German form, a respectable form, suitable for middle class, educated, acculturated German Jews, right? And perhaps I can show one slide of that.
Yeah, please.
Just a second, because this is a really nice example. Okay, this was the Eulenspiegel. Just a second. Okay, can you see now? So this is the Meisebuch, okay? And this is an anthology of Jewish tales, das Buch der Sagen und Legenden jüdischer Vorzeit, that Avraham Tendlau publishes in the mid-19th century. And it has all kinds of tales in it. And some of the tales were taken from the Meisebuch. And this is what he does. This is his modern form. So we can see
hang on,
here.
sorry. Could you just tell us who was Tendlau and what was
I'm sorry.
what was he doing with this book?
I feel already so close to him. We have this intimate relationship, and
who doesn't know about Tendlau?
Who doesn't know about Tendlau? But maybe I will use this remark to just note that really almost all the sources I use in my book were not studied before. So people like Tendlau, there are people who know him because he made some important works with idioms and expressions, Sprichwörter und Redensarten, but this literature is not very known. And I think, maybe Berta Papenheim was well studied. She's one of my protagonists, and she was well studied before from other angles. But the other protagonists and the works didn't really like their engagement with Yiddish. Okay, so even known figures like Moritz Steinschneider, for example, right? Or Max Grunwald in the Volkskunde, or Moses Gaster and others. So they were studied, but not their work on Yiddish and with Yiddish. And Avraham Tendlau, he was really one of the first folklorists or Volkskundler of Jewish Volkskunde. And we don't know much about him. In fact, we know very little about him. We know that he was the son of a rabbi and that he earned his living as a tutor. And he came from the area of Frankfurt, and he lived in Frankfurt as an adult. And he published a lot about Jewish folklore. He also received a medal of the Folklore Society of something like this. But that's it. I mean, we have his works, but we don't know that much about him. But he was really one of the first to translate from Old Yiddish literature. And it's not a coincidence that it is around the mid-19th century, because before that, when we are still in the first generations of the Wissenschaft des Judentums or Volkskundler and so on, they are still rejecting Yiddish. Because Yiddish is not dead enough yet, right? They still have to struggle for emancipation, for reform, and they want German. They don't want Yiddish and Yiddishkeit and the entire rabbinic culture it brings with it. They want a break with the past. And only from around 1840s and a bit later, with Tendlau and then with other scholars and authors as well, we see this change of perspective. And suddenly, oh, wait, we have here wonderful works and we're going to lose them unless we translate them and retell them and keep them published. So what he's doing, he includes some of the stories of the Meisterbuch and also from other Old Yiddish compilations. He puts it into his Buch der Sagen und Legenden. But as you can see, first of all, it's completely German, right? The translation is full translation into standard German, Hochdeutsch of the time, with the script, with everything. But he also transforms prose into poetry. Maybe it's like more respectable, more literary-like for his audience. And another thing that he does, we can't see it here, but at the end of the book, he has annotations, Erklärungen, Anmerkungen und Erklärungen. And there he really gives a philological and historical apparatus. So the Meisterbuch is not only transformed into a middle-class German literary work, but it's also suitable as a scholarly work with all this apparatus, which of course reminds us of the project of the Brothers Grimm and how their compilation and anthologies of German tales were later on given this entire huge apparatus. So Tendlau is definitely going in this direction. And just to show that this was not the only option to translate from Yiddish into German. So we have another example of the Meisterbuch, almost a century later, translated by Bertha Papenheim. And here we see that Papenheim kept the prose and in fact translated, this is not standard German. This is a bit like Yiddish German, right? And she kept like the Hebraisms and then in brackets the German translation, like Moshe Rabbeinu, unser Lehrer Moses. Kli, in brackets, Gret, Yam, in brackets, Mer. So she keeps the Hebraisms and also the syntax is very Yiddishized. So this is a different mode of translation. So we see the same book, and of course no scholarly apparatus, no historical comments, no philological ones. And she also writes in the introduction, this book doesn't have any scholarly pretenses. Okay, so this is just to say that even if we say, okay, the Meisterbuch was translated by German Jews into German, we have very different translations, with each translation really serving different purposes, different agendas, different modes and tastes of the translators, but I think also mainly different agendas.
Could you speak more about the agendas? I mean, going back to Tendlau, 1842, the book of the legends and folk tales or whatever of the Jewish people. You mentioned the Brothers Grimm and that sort of larger European project, but starting in Germany of collecting folk tales and crafting a national mythology has been going on for a few decades. And also, you mentioned the Brothers Grimm in relation to the attention to philology. So the sort of like scholarly working out of like, what does this word mean? What does that word mean? How does that all, the sort of political valence and the larger political cultural project that we associate with the Brothers Grimm and Romantic nationalism more broadly, how does that play out when these kinds of things bubble up in relation to Jewish literature, Jewish language, and Jewish culture?
Okay, so maybe I will first say something more general about the agenda of this entire project of giving Old Yiddish text afterlife, and then we can look specifically at the angle of Tendlau. So I would say that this entire project should be seen as it was not just an archaeological or antiquarian interest in the past. These authors, scholars, translators, they had a very specific agenda. And in broad terms, we can say that their agenda was the creation of a specific German Jewish subculture, a subculture that would allow German Jews to balance between their German and Jewish identities, between their Jewish past and the German present. So they want this literature to facilitate or even support and enhance the attachment of modern German Jews, most of them already acculturated, secularized. They want to enhance their attachment to Judaism, to Jewish tradition, culture, and the communities, but not on the expense of what they already gained in acculturation and emancipation. They want to support this project as well of acculturation. So we have here two, it would seem incompatible purposes, right? That they want to be Jewish and they want to be German, and now they have to deal with that. And I think that Old Yiddish literature was perfect for this agenda, because Old Yiddish literature, if you remember what I showed at the beginning when I showed the different genres and groups inside it, we saw that it derived both from Jewish literature. It translated from Lashon Kodesh, from Hebrew Aramaic, and promoted Judaism. But on the other hand, it also borrowed from the German surroundings. And so the different authors and translators could either emphasize the fact, oh, look, this is a wonderful Jewish tradition, and it can, it shows us what true faith is, and how wonderful the Jewish home was, and the cheder and the synagogue. There's a lot of, like sentiment and oh, look at this wonderful Jewish religious tradition. Maybe we should not lose it. Maybe we should stick to it and not just, secularize and become German. But on the other hand, and sometimes these are the same authors, okay, because they just go in these two directions. They look at this corpus of translations of all the early modern German literature, right, that was translated into Yiddish, and they say, oh, look, it's a wonderful proof, a wonderful evidence for the acculturation and integration, and they also use the term assimilation, right, of the German Jews into German culture and society already before emancipation. I mean, emancipation, it's very late, but our roots as Germans, they start in the Middle Ages.
Right.
And the Meisebuch is really in the middle of these two genres, because it has both the the Jewish tales in it, yeah, and it has German tales in it. So the translators and the scholars who work with Meisebuch, the Volkskundler, they could use both aspects, and they did. So Tendlau, as I said, on the one hand, it's very important to him to keep the heritage, not to let it go. It's very important that we have our folklore, that we know, what our roots are, that we know of what the Jewish, like what kind of treasures, right, the Jewish people created. This on the one hand. But on the other hand, his project was meant to support the acculturation, to show, look, our Jewish heritage, it doesn't have to be in this ugly Yiddish. It can be in German, and it can be middle class. And you can read what your grandparents read in the early modern period, but you can still be acculturated German Jews.
Right.
And you don't need to give up your new German culture if you want to get in touch with your heritage, right? So this is what he's doing, and Bertha Pappenheim is already beyond that. I mean, in the
so that's like
1920s.
Exactly. So, but that 100-year span, Tendlau kind of in the middle of the idea of folk tales and literature as being an indispensable part of national identity for anyone.
Yeah.
But then also right in the period of emancipation, or just after civil liberties have been granted in parts of Europe to Jews. Then 100 years later, Berta Pappenheim, um, it's a different world. And so what are the political and sort of cultural political aspects of her project? What is she up to in the 1920s?
So she's not concerned about the acculturation of the German Jews. Okay, so
Right.
Tendlau is still very early, and he wants to support that, and help the German Jews be German while maintaining the Jewish identity. Pappenheim doesn't need to do that. Everyone is German anyway, and she's much more concerned with keeping the Jewish heritage, keeping the attachment to the Jewish community, to the Jewish tradition, especially that of women. Berta Pappenheim was a feminist leader, and she worked a lot for the rights of women, also broadly, but also specifically within the Jewish community. And she saw these translations as bringing to life a lost feminine Jewish tradition. So this is the emphasis that she puts. Even though everyone read the Maise book, but still, Old Yiddish literature had this, probably still has, this aura of being, or stigma, if you like, of being a women literature, right? Because all men, of course, knew Hebrew and just read, the Talmud from day to night. Of course not, but this was the idea. So it became known as literature for women. And for Pappenheim, it's very important to bring to life this specifically female Jewish tradition, Jewish spirituality as she saw it. And you see it in the Zenerene and in the Meisterbuch, and you also see it in the Zenerene that she also translated in a year later in 1930. And there also, it's very important to her to bring it to her female co-religionists, right?
Right.
As a token from the past, from the Jewish female past.
What was the kind of spiritual angle that she was presenting?
Oh, actually, this is very interesting because it was all about, yes, it's such a wonderful spiritual tradition, and also the female reviewers who wrote about it in the German Jewish press were also very much enthusiastic. But in fact, and here we have another example of the problematics of diachronic translation, of taking an early modern text and bringing it to the modern time. Um, Pappenheim herself noticed, and she even writes it in the introduction to her own translation, that the Zenerene was a wonderful book for women, but it was also emblematic of their exclusion from the real thing being the study of the Torah, of the Talmud, as the men did in Loshen Kodesh, in Beis HaMidrash.
Right.
And she says, but women were excluded from there, and hence they were also excluded from power within the community, and they had to make do with, you know, the Tzenerene, which is wonderful, of course, and everything. So you have here this, this ambivalence and this
Yeah.
tension. Like she's a feminist and she's translating the Tzenerene. The Tzenerene was not feminist, and she's aware of that. Um, but she can live with that. She's fascinated with the text, and she says, "Okay, I will say my criticism, but then here it is in German for you, Jewish acculturated women in Germany."
Um, I'm mindful of the time, and we do want to leave some time for you to answer questions from the audience. And by the way, people have been posting questions. If you have, please keep posting them. But I would like you, Aya, to talk a little bit about another key term from your book, the post-vernacularity. And then also maybe to sort of bring us to the end of your story.
Okay, sure. This, of course, comes up indeed in my conclusion, where I say that, and actually, it's very close to this idea of afterlife. I mean, I took this term from Jeffrey Chandler's book, Adventures in Yiddishland, where he uses this term of post-vernacularity to describe the situation of Yiddish in the second half of the 20th century in in the US, in Northern America and in North America. And he's, of course, relating to modern Yiddish. And the idea of the post-vernacular means that in the second half, during the second half of the 20th century, there is a growing gap or discrepancy between the decline in the number of Jews who actually speak Yiddish, who become little and little by the day, but still the great interest in Yiddish culture. So the same people who are no longer speakers of Yiddish, okay, so it's not the vernacular, they're still interested in it. And they read translated Yiddish literature, and they go to hear klezmer music, and they use all kinds of Yiddish buzzwords in the speech, and they study the language or the literature. So this entire interest and engagement, he terms it post-vernacularity, because Yiddish is no longer the vernacular, but it has a new dimension, a new afterlife, if you will, in English. So he's referring to the situation of modern Yiddish after the Holocaust in the US. It's all in English. And what I wanted to show in this book, and I elaborate about it in the conclusion, I won't go into all details now, but what I suggest is that with the right adjustments and qualifications, we can see also 19th century Germany, 19th and early 20th century Germany, as a historical context that allowed the emergence of a Yiddish post-vernacular culture. This time, not modern Yiddish, but Old Yiddish. That this afterlife of Old Yiddish in modern German Jewish culture was in fact the post-vernacular stage in the life of Old Yiddish literature. The fact that it was only mediated in translation, it was spoken about, and so on. Now, of course, that the circumstances that led each kind of Yiddish, like modern Yiddish and Old Yiddish, that led them from the stage of being a vernacular to being a post-vernacular, the circumstances were, of course, incomparable. Modern Yiddish, after the Holocaust, after the Great Devastation, and a living, flourishing, a wonderful culture in its prime that was abruptly brought to a tragic end. And Old Yiddish literature, who was, dying peacefully due to social, cultural, political development, and nobody was very concerned about the fact that she was dying. In fact, most of our protagonists, my protagonists in the book, they were happy that she's dead, and they didn't want to revive it in any way. But they took it into the stage of post-vernacularity. So even if the circumstances of the death, so to say, were very different, what happens to the modern Yiddish and to the Old Yiddish as post-vernaculars in the post-vernacular era is indeed comparable. And I think that it's a very interesting lens to look at what happens to it in this stage.
Absolutely. It's particularly, I think, important and interesting to realize that post-vernacularity can play a role even when a language still is spoken, just not directly within that specific social or cultural context in which it becomes a post-vernacular. I think one other super interesting difference between, second half of the 20th century and the period you talk about, leaving aside, of course, the massive and obviously central historical differences that you mentioned, is the role that scholars played in the 19th century in the kind of creation or extension of the afterlife of Yiddish as a post-vernacular. Whereas, Jeffrey Chandler talks about all the different ways, especially music and performance and other cultural aspects. The protagonists, as you call them, of your book are not all, but mostly scholars. And I think one, most prominent example is Moritz Steinschneider, the Wissenschaft des Judentums, which you've mentioned a couple of times, the science of Judaism, the sort of first generation or creation of Jewish studies, mostly text-based, all text-based, really. Steinschneider is like the king of that, really a philologist and bibliographer, whose work, I guess, is mostly known in relation to his work on Hebrew manuscripts and books. So what did a Hebrew-focused philologist scholar like Steinschneider, what did he care about Yiddish books? And what was he doing in this story?
That's a great question. Actually, he had an integrity as a scholar, right? And his mission was to really recover and catalog and research all Jewish literature, okay?
Right.
So he didn't exclude Yiddish, but he worked only on Old Yiddish. And in fact, he allowed himself to work on Old Yiddish because it was already dead. And he even says so in the late 19th century. He says, for us, Yiddish is no longer a practical, but a philological, historical issue. So he really gave Old Yiddish a decent burial, like the Wissenschaft des Judentums were accused by Gershom Scholem. And they definitely do it in Old Yiddish literature. And Yiddish scholars, Eastern European Yiddishists from the time, Meir Wiener and Ber Borchov and Max Weinreich, they say, what, you're working on Old Yiddish, but you completely ignore modern Yiddish, and you don't even know Yiddish, you say nothing about it, that there is an entire vernacular culture in Yiddish flourishing just across the border. And Steinschneider was like, I'm not interested in jargon. Okay, jargon is let the Eastern European Jews, the Ostjuden, deal with that, right? I'm working on the German Jewish past. And this is, by the way, also a very important characteristic of the post-vernacular culture, is that it is very aware of its relation to a vernacular culture, like the historical consciousness that what I read is important because it's part of a past culture that is no longer alive, so to say, is no
Right.
longer here. And this is really a leitmotif that runs throughout the book.
Thank you. So now we're going to spend a few minutes fielding some questions from the audience. And then at the very end, so please stay on till the very end, I'm going to ask you, Aya, to talk about your current research and how that connects to this book. But there's one question that actually connects directly to what you were just saying. That is from our mutual friend and colleague, Iris Edelson-Schein. Hi, Iris.
Hi, Iris.
Who asks, do you find more critical approaches to Old Yiddish among German Jews? And then specifically, do you see Steinschneider's research on Old Yiddish as part of that sort of more critical phenomenon? And you just, answered the decent burial. And if so, how does it correspond with his and other scholars' attitude toward Hebrew?
Okay, so I think he was neutral. He was neutral because we have scholars, especially so Wissenschaft des Judentums from the first generation, like Jost and Zuns, who are really very, very critical. They really they write about it. Of course, they don't translate it or anything, but they write about Old Yiddish literature and Old Yiddish culture in their histories, in the history and the literary history they produce in the 1820s, in the 1830s. And they really reject it, and they are so happy that it's gone. And they praise Mendelssohn and his Bible translation for giving the death blow to Yiddish and putting German and Hebrew on the table. So this is very critical. Steinschneider, I didn't find expressions like this. But on the other hand, he's not as enthusiastic as later scholars are, or scholars from the second half of the 19th century, working also parallel to him, who are very enthusiastic about it. So he's very cold, right? He's doing his job. I think he only got upset when he was confronted with modern Yiddish, and that really, shook him.
Right.
Um, I think, but in any case, I think it was secondary to his interest in Hebrew. He just felt a need to write about it because it was there, and that's what you do.
Okay. Okay, and now two questions, not about the scholars, but about their theoretical readers. Margarita Lerman asks, what do we know about the readers of the translations and adaptations? Was it a more academic and intellectual endeavor, which it obviously was in terms of the scholars and
Mhm.
authors, but how many, regular people or lay people read these books? Who was the theoretical or actual audience? Um, and Jim Feldman asks, to what extent could he asks, to what extent could 19th century Germans understand the Yiddish of these original books? I would maybe specify, to what extent could German Jews understand either the language or the cultural content? How much you talked about diachronic translation, which certainly, was needed, but what aspects of it were legible and familiar and what were completely foreign?
Okay, thank you. I will answer very briefly because I see we're
Okay.
running out of time. So first of all, about the readership. So I have to say that this engagement with Old Yiddish literature had both scholarly and more popular dimension. So we have Wissenschaft Studentums and folklorists and researchers working on it, but we also see, for example, articles about it in the general German Jewish press and in family journals and community journals and so on. So it was also really for the broader public, and of course translations like Tendlau's or like Papenheim's and Tendlau's Buch des Sagen und Legenden, for example. It was a huge success, and it,
Mhm.
it had three following editions, and each edition was larger, and it also had a buzz. Now I can't really say about, just broad reception, but these works, for example, were reviewed. They
Yeah,
had quite a lot of reviews in German Jewish literature, in the German Jewish press, in the journals, periodicals, newspapers, etc., both in the more scholarly ones and in the more popular ones. And also, the scholarly studies were popularized.
right.
There were articles, saying what the scholars say in a simple manner, and so it was a broad discourse, and it appeared in many venues, and so I assume it got to more people. If they could understand it in the original Yiddish, it a bit depends. German Jewish, we say German Jews, but it's really a very heterogeneous
Yeah.
group, and some were more Orthodox and some were completely secularized or completely acculturated versus those who still maintain some Jewish education and so on. So it really depends, but I think that for a reason, you have, if Pappenheim brings in Hebraisms, then she puts in brackets the German
Right.
translation, just to make sure that everyone can follow. So I'm sure that there were some that
Right.
could still read Yiddish, but not many.
And that makes sense given the fact that, as you just said with Tendlau, there was a large audience for these translations. So, the people buying this wanted and needed it. And, the sort of like cultural reasons, I think, are all folded in there, that there's a sort of modern cultural, political, intellectual aspect to reading it in the scholarly translation or the more poetic translation that you don't get if you're pulling the dusty book off your grandfather or grandmother's shelf, right? There's a sort of modern presence to it. Um, all right. Well, we are a little bit past our deadline already, but we were told by the organizers that we can take a few extra minutes if we need to. And I'd like you to tell everybody about your current project and how it relates to this particular book, but also just to let us know what you're doing now.
Okay, so I'm not sure what my next monograph is going to be, but right now I'm very much into a new project, and this is the project Julia mentioned at the beginning. It's a project funded by the German Research Foundation, and I do it in collaboration with the amazing Astrid Lemke from the University of Mannheim. And we work together on a project on Old Yiddish adaptations of German literary texts in the early modern period. So I go back to the real Yiddish. And in fact, I never worked on Old Yiddish literature before. I only worked about what the Christians said about it and now what the modern German Jews say about it. And in this project with Astrid Lemke, we really work with the texts themselves, a certain corpus within Old Yiddish literature, these adaptations of German prose and fiction. What we aim to do in this project is, first of all, to facilitate the research in the field. So Old Yiddish literature is a field that has not been researched enough. And one of the reasons for that is that you need to be familiar both with the Germanistic and the Judaistic aspect of this literature, and you need literary and philological skills, and you need historical perspective. So we want to make sure that everyone who wants, students, scholars, laypersons, everyone who wants to deal with this field, with this corpus, will have something to start from. So we are working on a handbook that really gives all the information and all the details and the bibliography, everything that is needed to really embark on a research or independent study of these texts, of the Yiddish adaptations of German literature in the early modern period. We're also engaged, of course, in research of these texts and write independent research articles. And we are also working on a database on this corpus that we maybe one day we will enlarge to include the entire Old Yiddish literature. We don't know yet. But this is more or less what we do. So right now I'm working, this is my feeling, right? I'm working for the field of Old Yiddish literature to advance it, to support it, to facilitate research in it. But I enjoyed so much working with the literature itself and not just, the discourse about it, that something tells me that maybe my next monograph will be in this direction.
Well, speaking as a scholar of literature, I have to say I'm not surprised. Why wouldn't everybody be interested in literary texts? But this is super important work, and it sort of amplifies how important this book that we've been discussing also is a lingering legacy, because as you mentioned briefly, but it bears repeating, much of what you've described here was sort of unresearched, undiscussed in the scholarship. And some of the figures like Tendlau were semi-obscure, although, as you said, his book in its period was widely reviewed and widely read and widely purchased. But other figures like Moritz Steinschneider and Berta Pappenheim, in their own ways, are very well known and broadly discussed in the scholarship. And Steinschneider still used his scholarly work by other scholars. And yet, this huge chunk of what these figures did kind of disappeared from scholarly notice. And, the sort of beyond that is the corpus that they were working on. And it's also important to mention here the significance of the project that you're working on with Astrid Lemke is, in other languages like German, these medieval corpuses have been published and republished a million times with critical apparatuses. With Yiddish books, it's been only haphazard and fits and starts a little bit here, a little bit there. Not the whole thing, not even close. And it's simply not accessible. And if we want to go back to it, we can't go back through Tendlau because we can't sort of take away the apparatus of his political and his aesthetic agenda in order to do that work. So you've brought back to us a story about other scholars trying to extend that afterlife of Old Yiddish, and now you as a scholar are doing something in a similar vein, but I think that will ultimately be more transparently useful Um,
I hope so. I really hope so.
it's a collaborative project. Um, there are more questions in the Q&A, but I think we should probably stop now because we are at 2:08 and we were supposed to stop at 2. But I would just once again thank you so much for this wonderful discussion and most of all for writing this book, A Lingering Legacy, The Afterlife of Yiddish in German Jewish Culture, 1818 to 1938, published by Stanford University Press. And if you look in the chat, there is a coupon code for you to order it from Stanford with a 20% discount and get even more detail about these fascinating figures and the translations and adaptations that they wrote in German of Old Yiddish literature. So thank you, Professor Aya Elyada.
Thank you, Professor Simon Spinner. It's been a pleasure, really. Thank you so much.